Hey, friends, today we are going to be talking about how to rebuild trust and rebuild your marriage after cheating. Marriage is hard on the best of days, but when infidelity and temptation enters in, it makes it very painful. And my guests today are Mark and Jill Savage, and they're going to be sharing from their personal experience. You have tuned in for another episode of Your Hope-Filled Perspective, where it's always our goal to restore hope, renew minds, and empower listeners to live in their God-given identity. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Bengtson, and I'm so thankful you've joined us for this enlightening episode today. But I want to start today's episode off by reminding us of the scripture that comes from Romans 8:5-6, that says, "For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. For to set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace." And that's what we want to focus on today. My guests today are Mark and Jill Savage. Jill is an author and a speaker who's passionate about relationships, and she's been called one of today's most exciting female speakers, and I can vouch for that. Her honest, engaging communication is strengthened by her ability to make her audience laugh while they learn. She's the host of the No More Perfect podcast. And friends, if you have not checked that out, we will have all of Mark and Jill's information in our show notes that you can find at drmichelleb.com, because you're going to want to tune into that. In a life that declares we must be perfect, Jill's here to say, no more perfect. Mm-hmm. Jill and her husband, Mark, live in Illinois and have 5 children and 8 grandchildren. Welcome to the program, friends.
Well, thank you. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, we're excited for this. And the verse you read is core to our ministry.
It is. It's our verse.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that. We were talking a little bit before we pressed record about the fact that God makes us walk through those areas that we speak and write about. And what I found is so often our ministry is born out of our own hurts and trials. So how did you begin ministry and speaking about no more perfect marriages?
Well, we've always had a passion for families and for marriages. Right. So Mark was a children's pastor for 10 years before we church planted for 10 years. And we started way back when he was a children's pastor, and then he became more focused on family ministry. And we started really being intentional about investing in marriages.
Right. And we personally, we practiced all of the important things, date nights, vacations, just between the two of us, working on communication. We even knew each other's love language, but imperfect really hit us.
Yeah. So it was in 2010 that Mark decided that it was time for him to retire from ministry. And that had been 20 years of church ministry. And he was pretty beat up and he was pretty worn out. Yeah. And so he left ministry and started his own construction business. Right. And I knew that he was not in a good place emotionally, and I knew he wasn't in a good place spiritually.
Yeah, I wasn't prepared for the crisis that I was living in. I really had an identity crisis. I would have never said that my identity was in pastoring, but to no longer have that office, to no longer have that title, or the connection to people in that way, really wrecked my heart and my soul, and began to really erode, erode. It really started to reveal all those hidden places that God wanted to get to.
hmm And Mark has struggled with depression through all of his adult life.
Right.
It was undiagnosed until probably halfway through our 38 years of marriage.
That's kind of the DNA of my family.
Yeah.
My dad and then his father, and I'm sure it just travels up the line.
Yeah. And so I knew he often would get down, but this in 2010 was like the lowest down I'd ever seen him. And he just began to spiral. And by 2011, he was very disengaged. He was very angry. He was angry at me. He was angry at God. He was angry at the world. He was just angry.
Yeah.
Did you
And
recognize that, Mark? Did you recognize that you were angry?
I did. I was incredibly disappointed and discouraged. I was probably more angry at God than anything. That I was mad at the church. I was mad at Christians. I felt like the Lord really. I would say I teetered on the edge of that God really doesn't care, and that he doesn't love me. I'll never do enough. And all the lies that I had wrestled with my whole life really were revealed. Even though I had wrestled, I mean, I had honestly tried to defeat those lies, but I didn't realize that more than anything, I worked to defeat those lies in my own strength.
Okay.
right.
And it was
It was in 2011 that he began an affair relationship
right.
with someone from his past. That's one of the things we talk about now. When an old high school girlfriend or boyfriend looks you up on Facebook and you get a message, what do? Well, you do what scripture says. You should run. You hit delete and you do not engage.
Yeah.
But he was not in a good place emotionally, and he chose to engage.
Right.
And that, and at first it was like, it's no big deal, but it became a big deal. It became an emotional affair, and then eventually a physical affair.
Yeah.
And
how did that come to light? How did you find out about that, Jill? Because that's something that stays hidden for a long time for many people in their marriages.
Yeah.
I know. I initially found out about the emotional affair by observing. I mean, we were out to eat at a dinner or out to eat dinner at a restaurant, and he ran to the bathroom and left his phone on the table, and she texted him. And I kind of was like, wait a minute, what is this? And so he reassured me it wasn't a big deal. She was going through a divorce. He was helping her, but it went underground at that point even more.
Right.
And then it was probably 3 months later when again, I had actually been speaking and I'd come home very late. We're about 2 hours south of Chicago. So I'd been speaking in the Chicago area, drove home late, 1 a.m. And he was in bed holding his phone, but passed out. He'd also been abusing alcohol at that point in time.
Right.
So he was passed out from being under the influence, which was not ever a part of our world. Like
I was really walking a path, doing the very opposite that I'd spent years helping people not to do as a pastor. But out of that deep discouragement and disappointment with life, I was just turning to myself. I was really
Romans 8:5. You were living in the flesh.
Yeah.
And experiencing death.
Yeah.
Right. Which is that part of Romans 8:6. And so anyway, I remember, I'll tell you, Michelle, I remember I had a girlfriend who, she knew Mark wasn't in a good place. And she would tell me every time we were together, Jill, I'm leaving my phone on all night, anytime you need me. And I'm like, Becky, I am not going to call you in the middle of the night. And she's like, I know, but I'm just telling you, I'm just leaving it on. So she told me that for probably a month. And literally at 1 a.m., I pick the phone up out of his hand and I look at the messaging on it. And sure enough, at this point, they've been together and they're talking about that. And I want to throw up. I mean, there was an immediate or physical response. I really felt sick to my stomach. I took his phone downstairs and actually placed a call to this person. And of course, she thought it was him because it was his phone. And I told her I knew, and I told her that I expected her to never communicate with my husband again. And then the next call I made was to my friend Becky. And we cried and prayed and cried and prayed all night. And the next day we actually had a counseling appointment. So I chose to not reveal what I knew until we were in the counselor's office, which was really hard because you want to lash out.
Right.
But I'll tell you what, God was, I didn't do this perfectly, but God was really teaching me to walk in the Spirit. So we had Romans 8, 5, and 6 going on, and he was walking in the flesh. And I was sometimes walking in the flesh for sure, but a lot more often walking in the Spirit, because I mean, the flesh side of me would have just lashed out at him in that moment. But the Spirit side was going, okay, Lord, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And God was saying, I need you to wait till you're sitting in that counselor's office. So I was very, very grateful for that. And initially, I mean, he said, yep, you're right. I am. And I am not stopping. I mean, he was arrogant, which is so not my husband.
Yeah.
And so that was October of 2011. And then, and their conversations had started June. And then he actually did go back and forth. He would recommit to our marriage. He would say he was leaving. He would recommit to the marriage. He did that 7 times.
Right.
And finally, in February of 2012, he left. And so we were separated, a separation he wanted, I did not. But I knew that if he would return to his God, he would return to his marriage and his family. I knew that. But it was a really dark year. And we're very, very grateful that in April of that year, we had, in fact, it was on Easter Sunday, Mark actually had his own personal resurrection.
Yeah.
He made a complete U-turn, and I saw the surrender happen. I saw him literally give up to the Lord, like give up in a good way. And that began the U-turn. That was the U-turn that began the healing process. And it probably took us another 18 months to 2 years to fully heal from the damage done.
So Mark, what brought you to that point of surrender and that U-turn?
Well, I had convinced myself that Jill and I it wasn't worth the fight anymore, that there was places in our marriage that I couldn't get past, that I couldn't resolve. And so I had also convinced myself that my kids would understand, mom's a hard woman to live with. I don't blame you, Dad. I don't know how you lasted this long. And
that wasn't the way it played out.
None of it played out. Yeah.
No, at the time we had our 3 older kids were in their 20s. A couple of them married. And then we had 2 teenagers still at home, and all 5 of them were heartbroken.
Yeah.
Absolutely heartbroken. Their world was turned upside down.
And so I had all that happening. And then this relationship began to become almost relationship like Jill and I were having. That there was animosity, there was frustration between us, uh, and so I wrestled with, I need to just make it right with Jill and get back home. And yet my flesh didn't want to, that there's a lot that happens in Romans 8. So,
Yeah.
So I was wrestling with that. And then I really convinced myself that I'm going to pursue a divorce. I've already blown everything up. I might as well walk this out and live whatever happens. And all of that was just foolish thinking that was really fueled by my flesh. And I finally got to the place on that Easter Sunday where I needed to really surrender. I had wrestled with God on and off. I'd be out in the yard mowing and yelling and screaming at God that I didn't feel like he didn't show up the way I expected. He didn't act the way I demanded, and he just wasn't who I thought he was going to be or who I wanted to create him to be. And so on that Easter morning, we had been up helping our daughter. She had our second grandchild, and she was up in Chicago area. And so I was invited to go up there, which was good, but it was also so hard for everybody, because Jill and I were separated, and I'm just being me. And so it was that when we got back, Jill invited me to go ahead and stay at the house.
We had gotten back at like 2 a.m.
Right.
And the next morning, our boys got up and just went to Easter. Well, they were serving at church, one on the worship team, one doing sound. So they got up and got themselves to church. So just he and I were home that Easter morning.
Right.
And Mark walked up the stairs and came into the bedroom and had a piece of paper, and he'd drawn a line down the middle of this piece of paper. And he said, "This is my yard. This is your yard. This is the fence. We've been meeting at the fence, but I don't want to meet at the fence anymore. I don't want you in my yard, and I don't want to be in your yard." And
then I told her I was filing for divorce this following week. And
my heart just dropped. I mean, I just was like, oh my gosh, this isn't what I wanted. And I'd been standing for my marriage at this point for almost 8 months, and no, 10 months. And so I, again, though, okay, Lord, I don't want to say anything until you tell me what to say. And so I was just quiet. And the only thing that came to my mind was, you know what, Mark, Jesus didn't want to go to the cross either. He asked God in the Garden of Gethsemane to take this cup from him. Wasn't there another way? Wasn't there another possibility? And then Jesus said, "But not my will, but yours be done." And that was all that came to my mind. And that was all that I said.
What was crazy was on the backside of this sheet of paper, I literally, this is embarrassing, but I literally kept a list of all the things that were wrong with Jill and with Jill and I. And I ruminated on that for years. I thought I believed to my core that we were not repairable. And I believed to my core that I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life and be unhappy. I mean, all the messages that I had heard for years. And when Jill said that about Jesus Christ, all of a sudden,
well, first, you didn't even know it was Easter.
Right.
He said, "Wait a minute, is today Easter?" I mean, he had not a
I
clue.
was so out of it.
And I was
I-
like, yeah, it is.
and it was in that moment that I just heard the Lord speak to me, Mark, if you'll trust me for the list, I'll take care of the rest. And I was really desperate. The mess I was looking at was huge, uh, all around me. And in that moment, I looked at Jill and I said, you are so right. I'm going to pray that same prayer. And so I modified the prayer, don't take this marriage from me. I didn't say that. I said, Lord, I'm going to trust you for the mess, and not my will, but your will be done. And I'll do whatever you want. And I felt like for the first time in my life, now as a pastor, I would have never, ever been able to say that. But the first time in my life, I had really surrendered and submitted to Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, and that I was committed to absolute obedience. And I didn't even know what that meant. And I also would say that I am not a guy in the past who was characterized by obedience to the Lord. I was always the child who's looking for loopholes and looking for ways to not be obedient.
So literally, he went from declaring that he was going to file for divorce to praying that prayer of surrender. And I physically saw him change before my eyes. Like I saw the weight lift off of him. And I didn't trust it at that moment. There had been a lot of pain, a lot of hurt, but I also saw that. And he finished praying and he looked up and he said, could we go to church?
I hadn't been to church in, I don't know, probably 10 months.
Since you'd
longer.
actually, because he'd stayed on as a teaching pastor at our church, even after he'd left. And the day I found out about the affair, he was supposed to preach that weekend and he'd been removed from preaching. So he hadn't really been back in church since then. And so I said, yeah, I'd love to go to church. And so as you can imagine, when we walked into church, our boys' eyes were just, as well as the church family, that had been an important part of our life for so many years. And then after church, he said, can I come home and spend the afternoon with you guys? And I said, sure. And so he spent Easter with us. And by that night, I'll never forget, we were sitting on the couch and he looked over at me and he said, I can't even remember what was on the list.
Wow.
I could have recreated it, obviously.
Like he could have recreated the words, but it wasn't, there was nothing holding him to it.
It was like, I was a big old fat bathtub that was full of this toxin that had been just swirling and churning for years. And when I surrendered, the Lord pulled the stopper and it was gone.
Wow. What a picture.
But that really began the journey of walking through the pain and not running from it, but walking through it and rebuilding trust.
And I want to talk about that next. Friends, we're going to take a real short commercial break. But this conversation is so important because even if you are not struggling in your marriage, you know people who need your love and support and compassion. So we're going to take a real quick break. And when we come back, we're going to continue this conversation on how to rebuild trust and rebuild your marriage after cheating. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Your Hope-Filled Perspective, where my guests today are Mark and Jill Savage. And today we're having a difficult but important conversation on how to rebuild trust and rebuild a marriage after cheating. Mark and Jill, can a relationship go back to normal after cheating and infidelity?
Well, I would say that you are not nearly as naive as you were before something happens like infidelity.
And I would say that I didn't want to go back to normal. Normal was toxic. It was unhealthy on my part.
Uh-huh.
It was unhealthy.
I mean, both of us brought unhealthy dynamics.
So we didn't want to go back to business as usual. We wanted something new.
Sure.
We wanted the Lord to do a work that would free us, would allow us to live out Romans 8, that we brought life and peace to each other. And that was the path that we really pursued. And
ultimately, what we believe is that with two willing people, any marriage that has experienced broken trust can be restored. And it can be even stronger.
right.
I would say our relationship is so much stronger than it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
But we did the work. We did the hard work, the hard emotional work.
Mhm.
And we now call ourselves Mark and Jill 2.0.
I love that. I love it.
Yeah.
So
We like those people better too.
I do. So instead of talking about, can you go back to normal? Can you rebuild trust after
yes,
cheating and infidelity? Because I'm thinking you don't want to
absolutely.
go back to normal because normal was what got you there in the first place. But can you
Yep.
rebuild the trust after cheating?
You
Yes.
sure can. And we have experienced that ourselves. And now really our life's work is to help other couples experience that as well, because we know the path out of the broken trust into rebuilt trust.
Mhm.
And so that's really our passion, is to help lead people on that path.
Right.
How long does that take? I'm surprised when you say 18 months to 2 years, because that wound had to have been deep.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't think it was done in 18 months to 2 years,
Okay.
but it's almost like a house that didn't have a good foundation.
Mhm.
We had to the Lord really worked to remove that old foundation
Okay.
and then build a new foundation. So I would say 2 years in, we had the foundation. Now we get to build on top of that. And so
That new relationship.
And
we were building all the way through that
Right.
2 years. But I would say, because, and it depends on how that trust is being rebuilt.
Mhm.
It depends on how honestly, the one who was, or the one who betrayed the trust, the one who broke the trust, will have the biggest impact on how quickly that trust is rebuilt.
Mhm.
Because if they are defensive, if they are not humble, then every time that there's some sort of an interaction, trust is broken again.
Right.
So what really was the key, there were a handful of things that were really key that Mark did very right. That was an important part of the journey. One is that he began to look at accountability as something to push to me instead of something for me to pull from him.
Right. I didn't want
Oh,
I didn't want to be
Policed.
by Jill. I didn't want to be parented by her.
right.
And so part of what we had to figure out was how she didn't want that either. So how do we move forward? And so I began the process of pushing accountability, pushing information to Jill. I opened up all my passwords. My phone was locked down. I had
Before and now, and you opened it all up.
emails. I deleted some and or all the ones that weren't needed. and then gave Jill passwords to all those.
But then he would do things like, oh, like, okay, our moms both live 2 hours away, but in the same city that this other person lived in. And so if he needed to go with his mother or like go help her do something, instead of, and maybe I couldn't go. He would say, you know what, I really need to go help my mom with this project. Since you can't go, I'm not going alone. So I'm going to ask my friend Carl to go with me.
Yeah.
And Carl is on disability. And so he has a lot of flexibility in his schedule. And so I didn't even ask Mark to do that.
Mm-hmm.
He chose to not be naive, not put himself in a possibility of compromise, and just to make sure that there was ability.
Mm-hmm.
And so I so appreciated that. I really did. And so he literally was just not giving me any place to worry.
Right. I felt like I had raped Jill's heart and my kid's heart, and I needed to do all I could to protect and rebuild their hearts.
Mhm.
And so the posture for me was, I am not going to do anything until God tells me to. So like a daddy holding a toddler's hand, I was the toddler saying, okay, Dad, whatever you want me to do. And I would walk at where he wanted. Now, I didn't do that perfectly. And also, I didn't reveal everything to Jill perfectly. Like, I was such a mess. I couldn't remember half the stuff I did. And so disclosure came out in chunks, which
Unfortunately is a part of the journey sometimes. I
Right.
remember even saying to my counselor, okay, when do I stop discovering things or finding things? And he was like, Jill, unfortunately, I know you just wish that everything would be put on the table, and there is value in a full disclosure. But at the same time, there were things he was such an emotional mess. There were things he was like, oh my gosh, I forgot about that email address. Oh my gosh, I forgot about this. So there were, and I sensed he wasn't lying to me on that. He wasn't, he just was such an emotional mess that there
Yeah.
was a lot of cleanup.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but we need to go back to that for just a second, because that was something that you said in the beginning, Jill, is that you knew Mark wasn't okay. You knew that emotionally he was really
Mhm.
struggling. Did you take the time to address that as well, Mark?
My part of struggling, you mean?
The anger, the depression.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh yeah, that
And
had
I
to be
tell
a
you
part of
what, a
it.
lot of it resolved when I surrendered. Uh, it was huge. Uh, but I started with a counselor, and I was meeting with 3 other men. Each man I would meet one-on-one, and they had a different role, which was kind of interesting, but it was what God put around me. And um,
And I would say the biggest thing for you was going back and really digging into your childhood,
mhm.
because that was fueling your shame and your anger
Mm.
and um
Well, and it was fueling it
and the
because
rejection.
yeah. So shame and rejection, I really had to work on. I was really led to work on that, uh, and part of my anger with the Lord was, uh, I just can't be free of me.
Mm.
When is that going to happen? And but it was so fascinating that when I surrendered, it was like my eyes opened up to the wisdom around me that I had rejected or ignored before. And Jill and I learned about attachment and the attachment theories and
attachment wounds.
yeah.
Mark's upbringing was very chaotic, a lot of abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse by a stepfather. And we knew all of that. And that had been a part of your journey, was trying to heal from that. But it had just all come to a head, and there were pieces that had just not ever really been fully dug into.
Well, and that's what I tell clients all the time, is that if you don't take the time to heal it, it's going to come out some other time that you don't plan, and it's not going to be a good time. So you need to take the time to heal it now, so it doesn't come out in an inappropriate way.
Absolutely.
Well, because what we often say is, if you don't get it out in an appropriate way, it will leak out in an inappropriate way.
Yeah.
So I have to ask, as the spouse, it could be tempting to say, well, this was all Mark's fault. Or it could be tempting to say, it was all my fault. And I know that you've said you didn't cause Mark's affair, but you did contribute to the dysfunction of your marriage. Can you explain that?
Yeah, that has been really important for me, to clarify that and to state that, because I think that you're right. We can go all or nothing either way. Like, oh, I was the terrible person and it's all my fault. Or it could be like, hey, he was the one that was unfaithful.
Right.
He's got to clean up this mess. It's like, no, I needed to look at it and go, okay, Lord, how do you want to use this to grow me? And honestly, I started doing that before Mark ever made his U-turn. Because, so go back, the day after Mark, I discovered the emotional or the physical affair, I begged God for direction. I begged him for direction. I mean, I was flat on my face on my living room floor, crying for hours, begging God for direction. And I heard only one thing. I heard, I want you to love him. That's all I heard. And I was like,
ouch.
Oh, what? Like, I mean, I was indignant at first, honestly. I was like, I remember standing up and looking up at heaven and just being like, you're kidding me, right?
Right. I think people listening can resonate with that. You've got to be kidding me.
Yeah. I mean, but I did. I said, you got to be kidding me. He's not very lovable right now. And I heard God whisper back to my heart, sometimes you aren't either. And I was like, okay, Lord, you love me when I'm unlovable.
Yeah.
I don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
I don't know how to do that. So you're going to have to show me. And so God began to take me to a deeper level of love than I had ever experienced before. He took me to Romans 12, 9 through 21, which I call unhumanable love. In fact, it's written in my Bible, Romans 12, 9 through 21. I wrote it down the side, unhumanable love. It's impossible to do without Christ. And so God began to grow me. The other piece that was, I knew, because we had started some counseling before all of this had started, and we had done counseling off and on over the years. So that wasn't new for us, but I knew that I needed to get serious about my tendency to avoid emotion. So my upbringing, while it was a loving home and it was a loving family, we just didn't do emotion. So I was the avoider in the relationship. And so I was the buck up. So if life gets hard, you just buck up, you just get strong, you just move on. Well, that doesn't make you a very compassionate person. And so I knew that I needed to look into that. And on that day where I confronted Mark and about the affair, he chose to not return to counseling at that point in time. And I kept going because I was like, whether my marriage makes it or not, I got to figure this out. So I began my own healing journey, my own personal journey into understanding where I had wounds from my own upbringing, where I had wounds from past relationships, where I had lies that I was dealing with. One of my lies was feelings don't matter. Feelings don't matter. Only facts matter. Feelings don't matter. And so I remember the day that my counselor really challenged me on that. And he's like, I've heard you say that so many times. When was that lie planted? And I was like, it's a lie? I don't think it's a lie. He was like, it's a lie because you created in the image of God and God is a feeling God. And I was like, oh, yeah, you're kind of right, aren't you? So anyway, that began my journey of learning to love deeper, of digging into my own junk in the trunk. And I determined, in fact, we now have a course for couples or for individuals who are waiting on their spouse to re-engage, who are waiting on their spouse to make a U-turn. And we call it The Wait Is Not Wasted. It's an online course that we created because I was determined that my wait was not going to be wasted. If my marriage made it, then I needed to use that waiting time to do my own healing. If my marriage didn't make it, I needed to use that waiting time to do my own healing. And so, I really dug in, and I'm so grateful that I did. And so when I say I didn't cause the infidelity, but I did contribute to the dysfunction in our marriage, that's what I'm talking about. I wasn't particularly vulnerable in our relationship. And so therefore I sent a unintentional message to my husband that I did not need him. And that had to change. That was one way that I was contributing to the dysfunction in our marriage. I also had a critical spirit. So I was quick to call out the things that he did wrong, but not affirm the things he did right. That had to change. So that was a dysfunction that I brought to the table.
So important. Friends, we're going to take a real quick commercial break. But when we come back, as we wrap up the program, I've got just a couple more questions to ask Mark and Jill about how to rebuild trust and rebuild your marriage after cheating and infidelity. We'll be right back. Welcome back to your Hope-Filled Perspective. Man, we've been having a great conversation today with Mark and Jill Savage about how to rebuild trust and rebuild a marriage after cheating and infidelity. Mark or Jill, either one of you, I think it begs the question. I'm sure we've got listeners who want to know, does the pain after cheating and infidelity ever go away?
Yes.
Yeah, God heals it.
Yes, it does. It absolutely does. I mean, this is in the rear view mirror of our lives now. And we talk about it all the time. So there'd be even more reason for that pain to, to be brought up. But without a doubt, now I will say that because of Mark's humility, because of the way he handled my pain, because of the way, quite frankly, I handled his pain, I had to recognize that I broke his trust with my criticism. I broke his trust with my conditional love at times. I certainly broke his trust in not being emotionally vulnerable. We don't talk about that kind of broken trust, but that there was broken trust on both sides. So I would say definitely, though, when I would communicate, and here's what we've learned. You don't just say, I'm sorry once. You don't just ask for forgiveness once. It's literally, probably by the time you're all said and done, hundreds of times.
Well, it's the hurt happens in layers,
Right.
and there's so many perspectives regarding, or so many layers regarding each hurt. And
yeah, like one example is, on one day I might be really experiencing pain from the deception. And so I can remember one day I said to him, I'm just really struggling with the deception piece of this, like all that you did behind our back. And so he said in that moment, he came over and he looked at me and he said, I know that I was dishonest with you, and I'm so sorry. I am so very sorry. And I ask for your forgiveness for my dishonesty.
But if you had brought it up, Jill, then it would fester. That's the way the enemy works. It would fester and it would grow, and you can start accusing the other one in your mind. But because you brought it out into the open, the enemy likes to keep us in secret.
Yes.
And infidelity is in secret. But then even your fears, your pain, if you had kept it down in secret, Mark wouldn't have known or had the opportunity to try to come and repair that trust and make it right and acknowledge, I get it. There's a reason that you're struggling with the deception, and I take responsibility. So it's on both people.
It is. And that was a huge, yes. And that was, if you remember, I'm Miss Buck Up, right? So in order for there to be a Mark and Jill 2.0, there's got to be a Jill 2.0 and a Mark 2.0. And we got to bring different things to the relationship. So that was scary for me to be able to say that. Then it was so important that he handled it well. Like he handled those moments well, right? Because then it made it safe for me to say those things. And then he had a humble heart. And so I can remember that day. Let me tell you what happened the next day. I said to him, I am grieved today over how you have misused our money. Like I'm just finding things right and left, and we're going to be digging out of debt for a long time. And you know what he did? He came over to me and he said, I know I misused our money, and I hear you on that. And I'm so very sorry. I'm committed to not doing that anymore. And I'm committed to help clean this thing up. Will you please forgive me? Wow. And I'm telling you, there was just time after time after time that looked like that. And that's the heart. That's how trust can be rebuilt. And then on top of that, we often say that there's kind of there's an equation for rebuilding trust, and that is consistent changed behavior over time equals trust. Consistent changed behavior over time equals trust. So we were both changing our behavior, like me even just speaking up and talking about what was hurting inside of me was changed behavior. And it was rebuilding his trust that I could be vulnerable and that I did need him. And he was changing his behavior. There was no defensive,ness there. He was pushing accountability, and he was bringing that surrendered guy to the equation.
Right.
This has been such a valuable episode because it's a topic people don't want to talk about. They're embarrassed to talk about. And I'm sure it's not easy for you to keep reliving that, but I know that you're extending hope to our listeners. And as we wrap up this episode, if a listener is resonating today with our conversation, and they're wondering if their marriage can survive or be repaired after cheating, what hope-filled perspective would you offer them as we close out?
We would say with God and two willing people, nothing is impossible.
Right.
He is not only the Redeemer, he's the Redreamer.
Mm.
And we've seen that.
Right.
I mean, we have seen that. We're just so grateful for how God has redeemed that very broken place.
Mhm.
And now we literally spend our life hosting marriage intensives in our home, creating online courses for individuals and couples who are walking through this, because we know that, in fact, we sometimes call ourselves, we're dealers of hope.
Yeah.
Love it.
And
I love it.
so there is hope.
Yes.
Absolutely. There's
There
hope.
is. Yeah.
And friends, that's what we want you to hear. With God at the center, there is hope. That verse from Romans 8 that we talked about in the beginning. If you are living in the flesh, it leads to death. But if you are living in the spirit, it leads to life and peace. And I just want to leave you, if you are struggling, if this is you and you're wondering if your marriage is going to make it, or if you even want it to make it, I want you to think about Isaiah 41:13 that says, "For I am the Lord your God, who takes hold of your right hand and says to you, do not fear, I will help you." And I think, Mark and Jill, you would attest to the fact that it was God who
Yep.
got you
Yep.
through this horrible experience so that now you can minister to others in the same situation.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Friends, I'm going to link all of Mark and Jill's information, Jill's website, their ministry, all of their books. No More Perfect Marriage. Make sure that you pick that one up. But I'm going to link all of their information in the show notes, which you can find at drmichelleb.com. And if you know someone who's struggling in their marriage and they need a dose of hope, would you consider sharing this episode with them? And while you're there, would you consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing to the podcast so that you never miss a weekly dose of hope? I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Bengtson, and this has been another episode of Your Hope-Filled Perspective. Until next week, may you have a hope-filled week.